She seems to me to have such a great head on her shoulders, and she credits you for that.
I'm proud of her.
How much behind the scenes wrestling do you guys do?
Oh, plenty. I'm not gonna say we don't. You have your mother-daughter relationship. You know, obviously you're gonna have ups and downs.
Somewhere in Los Angeles right now, a toddler is being driven to an audition. Somewhere else, a 7-year-old is memorizing lines for a callback while eating cereal in the backseat of a car. This is not an unusual scene. It has been happening for as long as Hollywood has existed, and it happens by the thousands every year, mostly unnoticed, mostly unremarkable, mostly forgotten the moment the audition ends. But every so often, one of those kids becomes famous. Not locally known, not book a few commercials famous, but famous in a way that reshapes a childhood entirely. Famous in a way that means strangers know your face before you've lost all your baby teeth. Famous in a way that means your job, at age 8, is more financially significant to your family than anyone else's in the house. This is a story about what that does to a person, not one person specifically. Though the industry is full of specific people whose stories rhyme with each other in eerie, almost identical ways, but about the machine itself, about what it's built to do, who benefits from it, and why the children who pass through it so often come out the other side carrying weight that has nothing to do with talent or fame, and everything to do with what happened to them before they were old enough to understand what was happening at all. Child stardom is often described, casually, as a kind of luck, a break, the right audition on the right day. And in a narrow sense, that's true. It does start with a break. But what almost never gets discussed with the same enthusiasm is what comes after the break. Because landing the role isn't the story. Staying in the industry, book after book, year after year, decade after decade, while somehow also being a person who grows up, that's the story. And it's a much harder one to tell because it doesn't have a clean ending. It just has stages. For most child performers, the industry doesn't find them. Their parents find the industry, usually with entirely good intentions. A relative says the kid is a natural. A local commercial casting call goes well. An agent takes a meeting. None of this is sinister on its own. Parents want to give their children opportunities. And for a certain kind of kid, expressive, comfortable in front of people, quick to memorize, the entertainment industry looks, at first, like any other extracurricular activity. Soccer league, piano lessons, or Wilhelmina modeling contract signed before the child can walk. On paper, they can look almost the same, but they are not the same, and the difference shows up quickly. A soccer league does not generate income for the family. A modeling contract can. And the moment a child's activity becomes a source of household revenue, something shifts in the underlying relationship between parent and child, whether anyone intends it to or not. The child is no longer only a child. They are also, in some quiet and rarely spoken part of the family's internal accounting, an earner. This is not a moral failing unique to any one family. It's a structural feature in industry that has always run on the labor of minors, and it has existed since the earliest days of film. Since long before anyone used the word momager, since long before reality television turned stage parenting into its own genre of entertainment. What's changed over the decades is not the underlying dynamic. What's changed is how openly former child stars are now willing to talk about it. Once a child performer starts working steadily, their life reorganizes itself around a schedule that no other child experiences. School becomes something to be worked around, not build a life around. Friendships become complicated by call times and shoot schedules and, eventually, by fame itself. Because other kids treat you differently once they've seen you on a screen, and that difference rarely feels like a compliment from the inside. Former child actors, across generations and across networks and studios, describe strikingly similar experiences when they talk about this period of their lives. They talk about learning very young that their value was tied to performance, hitting a mark, delivering a line cleanly, not causing delays on set, not costing production money. They talk about developing what several have independently called a kind of professional obedience, a habit of saying yes, of not making waves, of treating their own discomfort as something to manage privately rather than something the adults around them needed to know about. This is where the phrase groomed for the industry comes up again and again in memoirs and interviews from former child performers. Not in the narrow sense the word is sometimes used, but in the broader sense of being shaped systematically and over years into a particular kind of compliant, camera-ready professional. Some have described feeling less like children and more like small employees, paid, productive, and expected to perform on command, emotionally as well as professionally. None of this shows up in the finished product. Audiences watching a talented child actor on screen see charm, timing, and ease that looks entirely natural. What they don't see is the rehearsal it took to get there, the fatigue that comes from adult-length workdays compressed into a child's body and nervous system, or the quiet lesson being absorbed in the background. That love and approval are often tied to performance, and that performance is not optional. Financial dynamics complicate almost every child stardom story, and they are rarely discussed with the bluntness they deserve when a child becomes a primary income source for a household. And this happens more often than most people realize. The family's financial stability becomes entangled with the child's continued willingness and ability to work. That is an extraordinary amount of pressure to place on someone who cannot yet legally sign a contract on their own behalf. Laws exist in some places to protect a portion of a child or former's earnings. Trust structures designed to ensure the money isn't fully spent before the child becomes an adult. But protections like these vary widely by location, are not universally enforced. In any case, they address only the money. They do nothing to address the psychological weight of knowing, even abstractly, even as a child, that your family's stability depends on you continuing to show up, continuing to perform, continuing to be good at this. Many former child stars describe a particular and specific kind of confusion that follows them into adulthood. Difficulty knowing whether the adults in their life loved them or needed them. It is an agonizing question to sit with, and it rarely has a clean answer, because the two things, love and need, were so often intertwined for so long that untangling them becomes its own lifelong project. Every child star's career eventually changes shape. Some aim their way gracefully into adult roles. Some step back from the industry entirely, by choice or by circumstance. Others struggle through what has become an almost cliched narrative arc, one so common across the industry that has its own shorthand in pop culture. Promising child star, turbulent young adulthood, public struggle, and then for some, a quieter second act. For others, no second act at all. It is worth resisting the urge to treat this pattern as some kind of personal failing repeated across dozens of individual cases. A pattern this consistent, across so many different people, in so many different decades, points to something structural rather than personal. When a large percentage of people who pass through a specific kind of childhood experience similar struggles in early adulthood, with substance use, with relationships, with mental health, with a sense of identity untethered from performance, the more honest question isn't what's wrong with these individuals. It's what does this childhood do to a person, reliably, regardless of who they are? Psychologists and researchers who study childhood development point to a few recurring threads. A child whose sense of self-worth becomes tied to public approval during the years when identity is supposed to be forming internally often struggles, later, to locate a version of themselves that exists apart from an audience. A child who is taught, implicitly or explicitly, that emotional needs are secondary professional obligations often struggles, later, to recognize or advocate for those needs at all. A child who spends their formative years surrounded by adults whose income depends on the child's continued success often struggles later to trust that any relationship in their life is free of that same underlying transactional pressure. None of this is destiny. Plenty of former child performers go on to build stable, grounded adult lives. But the ones who struggle are not struggling in isolation, and they are not struggling for mysterious reasons. They are, in many documented cases, working through the direct consequences of a childhood that asked far more of them than any childhood should. There's a particular vulnerability that tends to follow people out of childhood like this, and it often shows up most clearly in adult relationships. Someone who spent their early years being managed rather than mothered, evaluated rather than simply loved, can be especially susceptible later to relationships that recreate familiar patterns, even painful ones, because familiar patterns, however damaging, can feel safer than unfamiliar ones. This is one of the more difficult and least discussed aspects of the aftermath of child stardom. The instinct to assume that struggling adults should know better or should be able to leave ignores just how deeply early relational patterns get wired into a person long before they have any say in the matter. Recognizing an unhealthy dynamic intellectually and being able to disentangle from it emotionally are two entirely different skills, and the second one is often much harder to build, especially for someone whose early template for love was built on conditions, performance, and obligation. In recent years, more former child stars have begun speaking openly about their experiences, writing memoirs, sitting for long-form interviews, naming specific practices and specific pressures they endured. This shift matters. It has started conversations within the industry about labor protections for minors, about the role of stage parents and managers, and about what meaningful oversight should actually look like for children working in entertainment. But it's worth being careful about how these stories get told once they leave the person who lived them. There's a tendency in media coverage of struggling or troubled former child stars to flatten complicated lives into simple morality tales, cautionary stories with tidy beginnings, middles, and ends. Real lives don't work that way. A person can be groomed by an industry and also achieve extraordinary, genuine artistic success. A person can love their family and also have been harmed by them. A person can be working seriously and sincerely toward healing and still not make it all the way there. Holding all of that at once is harder than telling a simple story, but it's the only honest way to tell it. The entertainment industry has made some changes over the decades. Labor laws for minors on set have tightened in many jurisdictions. On-set educators and welfare workers are now required in many productions. Financial protections for young performers' earnings exist in more places than they used to. These are not nothing. But structural protections only go so far when the underlying dynamic, a child's livelihood and family stability tied to continued performance and approval, remains largely unchanged. No amount of on-set tutoring addresses what it does to a child to learn, at 6 or 7 or 8 years old, that their worth is measured in bookings. What seems to help most, according to the people who've actually lived through it and come out the other side with some clarity, isn't a policy change. It's honesty, the kind that happens years later, often in memoirs or interviews, when a former child star finally has the distance and safety to say plainly what happened to them, without having to protect anyone's career or reputation in the telling. That honesty doesn't undo the childhood, but it does something else that matters. It gives the next kid and next parent and the next agent a slightly clearer picture of what they're actually stepping into. The audience for a child star's work rarely thinks about any of this while watching. They see a performance, and if the performance is good, they respond to it the way people respond to good performances. With admiration, with warmth, sometimes with genuine emotional connection to a character who exists ultimately, because a child learned very young how to become someone else on command. That's not a reason to feel guilty about enjoying the work. It's a reason to hold the work and the person who made it with a little more care than the industry itself usually does. Behind almost every extraordinary child performance is a story the audience will never fully see, a story about a childhood spent learning to perform before it was spent learning to simply be a child. The most honest thing we can do with that knowledge isn't to look away from it, and it isn't to turn it into spectacle either. It's to actually listen when these stories are finally told, in the performer's own words, on their own terms, and to ask seriously what it would take to build an industry that doesn't keep producing the same story over and over in a different child's life every time. If this topic resonates with you or someone you know, resources exist for people navigating high-pressure family and industry dynamics, including support networks specifically for former child performers.